Hi all, this is Jan Almighty and welcome to this video. Today I'm very excited because I'm kind of going back to the roots. For those of you who don't know, I actually started with this channel making videos about endgames. At first there were basic endgames talking about checkmates with simple pieces, talking about checkmates with rooks, bishops, queens, knight and a bishop, then advancing it, talking about pawn endgames, bishop endgames, knight endgames, all sorts of endgames, but pretty much all of them were basic endgames. And now what I wanted to do, I wanted to step it up a little bit and put it on, let's say, an advanced level. And how do I intend to do that? I wanted to take real life examples, which means in chess world positions from real games that have been played. Talk about the position from the endgame, so not analyzing the whole video, so talking about the position from the endgame and seeing what do you actually need to do in a certain type of endgame to go about and win that endgame. And today I'm going to start with it, and the first game that I wanted to show you, it is a game between Boris Gelfand and Wang, played in 2008 in FIDE Grand Prix. So to quickly show you the game, not analyzing, so don't want to stop myself on any opening moves, middle game moves. So I wanted to show you the transition into the end game, but I also wanted to show you quickly the opening from which you can actually get that type of end game. So to think about it, maybe it will maybe you will find it useful if, for example, you play the Slav defense like it was played in this game. Maybe it will happen if you play some different kind of opening, but I think it is important to know if you play one type of opening very often, which types of endgames you can actually get from it. And here we had a pretty stable opening from both sides. After a couple of moves, black here definitely equalized, grabbing the pawn in the center, and just after a couple of moves here exchanges, queen was here on c5, it forced the queen exchange, and in my opinion this is actually the transition from the middle game to the end game. Here bishop to f1 was played, and now what do you usually do in an endgame like this? Improving the possession of the kings. But before that, going with the kings, I actually wanted to cover that going into this endgame, both of the players are at this point equal. So you can judge by the pieces. So both of them have a knight, both of them have a light square bishop, and both of them have a rook. The amount of pawns is the same, pawns are the same, but the major difference is that black has the majority on the queen side, while white has the majority on the king side, which maybe shifts the advantage a little bit on black side because the kings are on the king side. So having a passed pawn far away from the king is definitely an advantage in the endgame. But okay, to actually go about and do something about and use that advantage, you definitely need to maybe exchange a little bit more pieces and everything. So what they do, they first start with improving the positions of their kings. Very important for the endgame, and here even we see a little bit of a trick from Wang. So I wanted to stop here and show you that. Here maybe you would, in a bullet or a blitz game, go quickly and try to improve even more on the position of your king, going for that queen side majority of the black side, but it is actually not so good. If you play king to d4, keeping in mind that the bishop is eyeing this diagonal here, so you cannot play the king to d3. If you play king to d4, knight to a4 is the threat. If you capture rook to d8, when the king moves, you are losing the rook and the game. So you cannot capture, obviously. If you play something like rook to a1, then knight captures, either king or pawn captures, b6. The pawn is defended, you are in this endgame, pawn up. It is definitely a winning endgame. But this isn't the endgame that I wanted to show you. Also, one other move, if you want to keep going to the queen side, king to d2, you see this beautiful communication between the pieces. The knight, the bishop, and the rook. The rook is eyeing here, the bishop is eyeing here, and now the knight is eyeing here. So let me just show this once again. This is checkmate, and the white king cannot go anywhere. But Gelfand isn't your everyday player, and of course he doesn't fall for it. He plays king to f2. We have bishop to c2 attacking the rook. Rook moves. Bishop to b3, not going immediately for the pawn. Knight to d5, bishop to d5, rook to c5. Once again, rook to e4, eyeing this pawn, or white now doesn't go for the pawn, but plays bishop to g2. All of these moves have certain aspect to it, definitely have some kind of a meaning to them, but what the position which I wanted to focus on is definitely this one. So white had an option to go rook to a5, stay in the endgame where he has a rook and a bishop against a rook and a bishop. After rook to b4, this pawn will fall, so the material will still stay equal, but you have to know that, for example, this bishop is a much stronger piece than this bishop, and this rook is a much stronger piece than this rook. Why? Because this bishop is a centralized square, eyeing this very nice diagonal, which doesn't allow the king to move on this side of the board, even though you're having this very nice pawn chain on dark squares. So very important, also another important lesson, if you're having if you're going into an endgame where you have a light square bishop, it is very good if you have your pawns on the dark squares. Vice versa applies for the different color bishops. So here it actually doesn't work in white's favor. So Gelfand, knowing this, didn't want to go and grab this pawn, so actually he wanted to go play and bishop to g2. And here Wang has a couple of options. He can play something like rook to d4 and go and exchange immediately and go into a pawn endgame, or he can play rook to a4 and go into a rook endgame. So after rook to a4, bishop to d5, pawn d5, rook to d5, go into a rook endgame, or he can play what he played into the game, rook to c4, force the rook exchange and go into a bishop endgame. And that is definitely the best idea he had, because after rook to c4, let me just show you. So rook to a5 doesn't work because of rook to c2, and this bishop will be captured, so that is the whole piece. And you don't have time to capture this bishop because then rook captures on c5. So here after rook to c4, bishop to c4, black is in an endgame where he has one major advantage, and that is this pawn. This pawn is on a light square, and this light square bishop doesn't have time to go and defend it. So you see in a couple of moves after this, king moves, bishop to a4, and now white plays bishop to king to c5. We find ourselves in the endgame of the same colored bishops, but black does have one pawn more. And is this enough to win the game? Well, in this situation it is, and I will show you how. Wang did go on and win the game, so this very nice show of endgame skill is, yeah, definitely very good. But I also wanted to focus on some other positions that could have happened if, for example, someone else was playing black pieces and trying to go about some different ideas in his head. So, for example, king is on c5, and what black wants to do in this type of position? Well, first and foremost, he would like to put all of his pawns on light squares now, because the king is kind of far away, and with his bishop defend this pawn. And as we can see, that plan is very much far away. But he also wants to use one other thing that is definitely at his disposal. He has 3 pawns now on the queen side, while white has only 1 pawn. This potentially means that he can use these pawns to maybe go here on c3 or on a3, force white to capture, and then the other pawn on the other file becomes a pass pawn. So there are a lot of possibilities and a lot of possible things that could happen. For example, if king goes to b6 and on b7, already there you know that the king will never be able to capture either of the pawns if they go too far. So here at this point, we have to know that, for example, bishop to b3 is the correct move to actually continue this game, and it is the move that was played in the game. What would happen if you would place something like a move like a bishop to b5? Go here and try play bishop to a6 and defend the pawn on b7. Then white simply continues with king to b6. You can play king to f5 and try to maybe enter here with a king to b7, and here the question is how to proceed now. You can maybe play h5, maybe you can play king to g4, but after this the king can simply go back, a4, king to c5, and after this pretty much everything, not a lot is working into black's favor. What happens after bishop to c6? Well then, bishop to c6, king to c6. It is very important to know that here, if white would go immediately for this, that this would actually be a draw. Because now, first, what black needs to do is play h5. So this is like an additional lesson to the endgame, but I would say that it's very important because even this type of pawn endgame is a very complicated endgame where you need to calculate a lot of things. Why is h5 important? Well, for example, if you continue immediately with king to h3, white actually has this move g4. And if you capture this pawn, g5 can be played. You cannot play h5 because f5, f6 is unstoppable and white is getting a pawn much faster than black is getting a queen much faster than black is getting a queen. So you capture here, pawn captures, king comes closer, you want to capture this pawn, g6, king to g4, and look at this. King goes here, and you will see just in a couple of moves that here white is quite simply much faster, and now b6, b7, b8 is becoming a queen. One critical position here is after king to f7, why is it important to play b5 instead of, for example, king to a5 to go immediately for this promoting square? Because now g5 is a possibility. And after the pawns are being pushed, now both of the pawns are out actually at the same time, and this is considered to be a draw, because neither of the kings were in check. So both of the players have the kings. Neither of the players have the ability to actually capture the queen. So that is the possibility, but that is the reason why you shouldn't capture, you shouldn't go immediately king to h3 because of the move g4. You have to play h5. But also what happens after king actually captures on g4? Then king b5, king can capture here, king can capture here, and now if you try, so if you want to go with the pawns, unfortunately, once again, you are too slow because white is moving only one pawn and you are moving two pawns to get a queen. And if you try to make it with a king, unfortunately here white is in time to actually create a opposition and always has the ability to come to a7 to one of the promoting squares. So king to d7, b4, king c8, king a7, and now, as you can see, just in a couple of moves, white will once again have a pawn, have a queen. I wanted to quickly show you this, even though I already have a couple of videos on these types of endgames. You can definitely watch them. They're a little bit older, but they are definitely true. And what you say once about pawn endgames, they definitely work forever in chess. So yeah. Those are the possibilities of pawn endgames that could happen if bishop to b5 was played, but bishop to b3 was played here, and now with the same idea, king to b6, unfortunately it doesn't work for white, sorry. Why is that? First, you defend the pawn, quite simple. You don't want to give up this very nice pawn, and if king captures on b7, then c5 is coming. Bishop comes here, even if you play king to b6, c4, king to b5, c3, pawn captures here, a3, and this pawn is unstoppable. So this is why white needs to play bishop to e4 here, because after c4, king c6, c3, capture a3, bishop to b1 is a possibility. You have to give up the bishop for the pawn, and even now, even though white has two pawns for the bishop, he is unfortunately losing this game because these two pawns are quite enough to actually go and get yourself a queen. So yeah, this is why here king to b6 wasn't played, but Gelfand went immediately for bishop to e4. When you simply defended the pawn, a4 once again, and we saw h4. Here bishop to d1, once again, the same ideas and the same rules apply. If king to b6 and going for this pawn, c5, c4, the same ideas would work. And both of the players know that, so Gelfand decided to shift his forces to the king side. And Wang continues correctly. Bishop to d1, putting the bishop on this diagonal and not allowing the expansion of the pawns on the king's side. But one thing that Gelfand now created is another weakness, and that is the weakness of the g3 pawn on the king's side. What Wang needs to do now, he needs to lock in the king side, and then he can focus back on the queen side. King to d6 was played, but once again, if you come to this pawn through b6 or through d6, the same ideas apply. So Wang Yu simply continued. He played h5, he locked in the king side, and now what will you do? Bishop to d3 was played. You could either play that or you can play the king back. The most important thing is that now black can actually make threats on both sides of the board. One thing is for sure, that now let's say this light square bishop is in a Zugzwang, so-called position where he needs to make a move. He will either stay on this diagonal or he will stay on this diagonal. Here Gelfand decided to play bishop to d3 and he moved from this diagonal. So this is the moment where he actually allowed bishop to f3, and that initial plan where I wanted to actually push the pawn so that my bishop is defending this weak pawn on c6 and slowly but surely communicate between the bishop and the pawns so that I can actually create a pass pawn. If, for example, he would decide to play something else like a bishop to g2, then he is allowing king to f5, and you can see that actually here king can enter through g4, or if, for example, you can play bishop to h3, then king is entering through e4. And now, once again, this pawn is a weakness. Black can even pick up these pawns. So that is the question, and Gelfand decided to play bishop to d3. After that we saw bishop to f3, king goes back and simply b5. You are pushing the pawns, white cannot do much about it, and now once again you can look at this position, and after a couple of moves things are getting a little bit clearer. Here you can work on both sides of the board. Either you will create a pass pawn on this side, or if white moves from this diagonal, so here king can come on f5, on g4 or in e4, but the main idea is that this pawn will be captured after that, the h4 pawn, and this one will also become a queen. So what happened in the game here? Bishop to c2 was played. There is not much that white can actually do here, and here king to e6. So I wanted to also show you if a bishop to f1, for example, so moving from this side of the board, here king to f5, bishop to h3, king comes on e4. King can capture on c6, but now, as you can see, there is a pass pawn. Bishop makes it in time, and now you don't even have to bother with this pawn. You can actually go about capturing these pawns on this side, and this is definitely the winning, because the white king doesn't make it in time to go about and actually capture this pawn. With a bishop and a pawn, it is definitely a winning endgame. So quickly wanted to show you that instead of moving the bishop to f1, Gelfand still decided to keep the bishop here, not allow king to f5, but now if you are not allowed to come to this side of the board, you go to the other side of the board. So when you started with king to e6, we saw bishop to g6, king to d7, bishop to c2, king to c7. Here Gelfand broke and played b3, but you have to understand, even if he decided to keep on moving the bishop here on this diagonal, that black had this very nice king walk like this, b7, a6, a5. Here he would be able to push b4, a3, create a pass pawn, and simply win the game. So b3 was played, a3 as an answer, bishop to b1, not allowing a2, bishop e4. If you capture the bishop, a2, a1 is queen, so bishop to a2, king to d7, and now once again you have made your point on this side. After a couple of moves, actually it was I think in this position that Gelfand resigned the game, but the reason is quite simply, when king captures on a3, you can play either c5 or you can just continue with king to f5, and here go for this pawns. So I'm going to quickly show it. This is now a pass pawn. If you try to create a pass pawn of your own, you are unfortunately too slow. Even for a couple of moves, black already has a queen here, and this is pretty much finished. So this is pretty much it for this video. I know it was a longer one. Usually the lecture ones and the endgame ones are. Hope you like the new format. If there are some suggestions or some comments. What do you think where I can actually improve? Definitely post them in the comment section down below. Other than that, hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Jan Almighty, and I will see you in the next one. Enjoy.